Good afternoon, everybody. Let me see. Reinaldo, nós estamos transmitindo? Estamos no ar? Okay. We are online by YouTube. Okay. If you want to write for your colleagues in Warsaw, they can see by the YouTube channel, IRI channel at YouTube. Oh, okay. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to receive you this afternoon at the Institute of International Relations. We have very important friends with us, Professor JAKUB ZAJOCZKOWSKI, and Professor Dorota Heidrich, both from the University of Warsaw. They are visiting Brazil. They have been in Rio de Janeiro for the last 3 or 4 days, that ugly city that nobody likes. But they made very important contacts with the Catholic University of Rio, PUC-Rio, no? Professor Angelica Miller is a professor of the university, the Federal University of Fluminense, the state of Rio de Janeiro, is a postdoctorate fellow with us here. And they come to the University of São Paulo in order to discuss some academic agreements between our universities. Also in a broad perspective between University of São Paulo and the University of Warsaw, but also between the IRI at USP and the Faculty of Social Politics, Political Science and International Studies of the University of Warsaw. We are discussing, and they stay this morning with Professor Rosana Reis and Professor Arthur Capella discussing some agreements on students' mobility, also undergraduation and graduation studies students, and also discussing the perspective of some joint research. So we are very enthusiastic about these perspectives. Tomorrow they will have a meeting with Alcani, is our agency for international cooperation, the agency, the office of the university. But as you know me, you, the students know me, and the professors, I never lose an opportunity. So there is no free meeting. They come to make some meetings, and I invite JAKUB and Dorota to talk about the war in Ukraine. No? I told them that our students, our researchers are studying very much the war. We are discussing this in our classes. We have some professors that produce some articles on this issue. All of us had participation in the media, so we are discussing. But the perspective, the close perspective of some experts is of extraordinary value for us. So I asked Professor JAKUB and Professor Dorota to talk with us about the war, on their perspective. Of course, an academic perspective, but also a personal perspective from who are very close to the events of the war. No, this is something that we do not have, and this is. And they agree immediately with my invitation, and I thank them very much because they are in a very hurry agenda. They are having a very intense agenda here in Brazil, but they agree, and they will spend the afternoon with us in order to make a presentation about the war, and after this to discuss with you the questions you have, the position you have, the information you have, in order to create an environment of exchange of perspectives. For them, is very important. For us, it's very important that they talk about the war. And for them, it's very important to know how is the perspective of the global South to the war. This is a project of research that JAKUB are developing, exactly the perspective of the global South. They have a list of countries: Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, South Africa. He will talk about India. And what you talk to them about your perspective will be useful for them to understand the Brazilian mentality and perspective and understanding of this, the most relevant event of our time, of course. No? So thank you very much, Dorota. Thank you very much, JAKUB. Each of us has the time you want. I believe I talked to Dorota about 20 minutes for each one of you, and after that we can open the discussion. Yeah. Okay? So the floor is yours. Who will begin? You? Yes. Okay. Yes, okay. Because we are making a transmission by YouTube. Mm-hmm. If you don't talk on the mic,
that won't be audible. Mm-hmm.
You have the control of your presentation.
Yes.
And welcome.
Thank you very much.
Let me just present very quickly. Dorota Heidrich has a very extensive experience in the field of political science and international relations. But as I present for you, she's the Dean's representative for development of English language programs. And what is important for you is because she's trying to make this agreement with us, she's the head of graduate and undergraduate programs in international relations and political science. So she is the person that deal directly with you when you be in Warsaw. Okay?
Yes. Thank you, Pedro. First of all, I would like to thank you, Pedro, and the entire community of the Institute of International Relations for having us here and for giving us this opportunity to hold the talk on the implications and consequences of the war in Ukraine. And I want to emphasize that we accepted this invitation with pleasure. And we thought that not having a lecture for students would be really a pity. We understood that it was at a very short notice. So that's why I would like to really, once again, warmly thank you for giving us this opportunity to talk to students and academics on this important topic. The first part of the presentation will be mine. And I must admit that we had several arguments or exchanges of views with JAKUB, how to present this topic in being in Brazil. The biggest question was, how much do they know about it? So we thought, well, they are IR students, academics, they must know a lot. But on the other hand, we had this impression that maybe what we know about the background and about the assessment of what really happened and how it was all happening, what was the importance of the timeline running from 2014 and onwards, that this could also add to our perspective on the war. So finally, we have decided that I will very quickly go through the background, but I will not tell you the history of Ukraine and the Soviet Union and everything, because I'm sure you are more than aware of it. But I would like to point to a few things which we think are important for the understanding of what happened in 2014 before the annexation of Crimea and the Russian invasion in the east, and then obviously this last year events that started on the 24th February 2022. So the geographical contextualization that you can see here in the slide and the map that you can see here in the slide is first of all, so what I want to draw attention to is first of all that this is the border that we have with Ukraine here, okay? So it's pretty long, and actually from the neighbors of Ukraine, also Romania has a very long border, but Ukraine is very, very close to us. Warsaw is somewhere here, somewhere here. So the distance between the border is not that big. It takes you just a few hours to get to the border with Ukraine. And actually, when the rockets were falling around Lviv, and even there was an incident a few months ago when the remains of the, as it was discovered afterwards, of remains of an anti-ballistic Ukrainian missile fell on the Polish territory. There was obviously audible. The bangs and the explosions are audible next to the border. This is also the external border of the European Union. And that's another very important thing, because not only of the European Union, this is also the external border of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which means that, well, right behind the doors of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization members, there is an ongoing war with a war of aggression that was started by the Russian Federation, who, as we know, for years had been regarded to be the enemy of the NATO and the Western Bloc altogether, before the Cold War period ended. And what is also important is that there is you couldn't see it from the previous map that was here, because it doesn't show the size of the Russian Federation, but you can see the comparison, and I thought this would be useful for us to take a look at, the comparison between Ukraine and Russia. And we are not going to go through those numbers, because I just want to make sure that you are aware of the differences that are there. In the territory, the size 600,000 square kilometers versus 17 million square kilometers makes a difference. The population, 36, and that's the number for now, after the migration from Ukraine. Approximately 8 million people are out of the country because of the war, and with 144 million of population in the Russian Federation. Also, the difference in the total GDP, even though the Russian Federation is regarded to be a falling economy from many perspectives, and many commentators talk about it in this manner, especially after the sanctions were included, but again, the difference is very much visible. But the most important thing for me here in this slide are those two boxes in the table. Why? Because they basically show you and give you an idea, or give you an explanation of what the Russian Federation authorities meant when they were saying that they have the right to wage a special military operation, as they used to call it, against Ukraine, because they wanted to protect Russian, ethnic Russians, or the Ukrainian population who were ethnically Russian, but with Ukrainian passports, or sometimes both Ukrainian and Russian passports. The Ukraine is the result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, nowadays, the geographical borders of Ukraine and the territory. It gained independence in 1991. And the ethnic composition in Ukraine is here, and as you can see, over 17% of the Ukrainian population are of Russian origin, and they see themselves as Russians, as the Russians' ethnic minority, okay? What is also important is that, obviously, during the times of the Soviet Union, again, I'm sorry if I'm saying something very, very obvious and self-evident for you, but I want to stress that because I think it's crucially important that during the times of the Soviet Union, the Russian language was regarded to be the language of communication for the Soviet Union, but also it was used in order to get together the different nations of the Soviet Union, different national groups, ethnic groups of the Soviet republics, and other autonomous territories in the Soviet Union. As you can see, the language is spoken in Ukraine. Ukrainian only 67% and almost 30% Russian. And I will tell you this, the ethnic composition and the languages spoken, and those, when you have the numbers on languages, it means that in everyday lives, 30% of Ukrainians have been using, or actually I should say, had been using Russian as their everyday communication language. Why? Because they don't use it that much anymore. Evidently what happened, and this gives me, maybe I'm going too much forward with it, but I want to stress it here. Ukraine was socially and politically, as political views were concerned, was divided according to the geographical regions of Ukraine. Here you have the two, this is from BBC 2014, you have a presentation of the results of 2010 elections, two candidates for the president, Yulia Tymoshenko and Viktor Yanukovych, and here you have the numbers. The numbers that are reddish, kind of, are the votes for Tymoshenko, and for Yanukovych you have the bluish color. And here you have a country, a map that shows the country, that shows Ukraine according to the language division. So all those, the darker the yellow or orange color is, the more percentage of people speak Russian. So if you compare those two maps, you evidently see that the pro-Russian, or the area, if I showed you the map with ethnic composition, it would be more or less the same. The area that was inhabited by the ethnic Russians, or people who prefer to speak Russian than Ukrainian on an everyday basis, was in the east. Okay, and that was the result of the migration from the territories of the Soviet Union towards Ukraine. There is one more important thing here, and that's about Crimea. Maybe I'll go back to the previous map because it's better visible with the, also with the Kerch Strait here, and with Sevastopol, which is the capital of Crimea. Crimea in this map is Ukrainian, but actually now, since 2014, it is being occupied, it has been occupied by the Russian Federation. And Crimea is a very specific territory because it is a territory that during the Soviet times was awarded by the Moscow authorities to the Soviet Republic of Ukraine, okay? And it remained with Ukraine after the Soviet Union collapsed and it was dissolved. Pre-2014, the 2014 is extremely important. I will say in a moment why. I'm sure you know about this, but I will stress it again to tell you also how our Ukrainian colleagues view the beginning of the conflict. But if you look at the military capacity of Ukraine and Russia from 2012, you don't have to even look at the numbers. You can look at the symbols here that shows you how much more the Russian Federation had, how much it had in order to take over Ukraine in just 2 weeks, as the authorities were promising. The idea was, okay, we will invade Ukraine 24th of February 2022, and it will take us 2 weeks to get the control of the whole country. Well, what happened was a little bit different, but there was a reason for it. And the 2014 that I started telling you about, the Ukrainians, and basically we in Poland to some extent as well, but I must tell you that I have been more attentive to it after February last year, because our Ukrainian colleagues have always been saying, look, the war in Ukraine started in 2014. It didn't start in 2022. They count the period of the Russian aggression from 2014, even though the international community and the world didn't react to that, to the events of the period 2014-2022, as the Ukrainians had wished for, okay? You have a timeline here. I'm not going to read through it. It's, you can have a look at it, but I think it's worth remembering where it all started. Again, I'm not sure how much you know about what happened before the Russian aggression, Russian annexation of Crimea and the aggression in the east. But it is important to remember that basically the majority of the Ukrainian population were pro-European Union. So they were for Ukraine to join the European Union. There was no talk about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization before 2014, definitely. And still before February 2022, there was very little on that, okay? But definitely the Ukrainians were pro-European, and the majority of Ukrainians wanted Ukraine to sign an association agreement with the European Union to perhaps in the future be offered membership in the organization and to become member of the European Union. But then in November 2014, President Yanukovych's government decided to quit the negotiations on the association agreement, not to sign it, and this is what started the Euromaidan protests in Kiev. The situation was becoming more and more unstable. People were in the streets. The authorities were reacting to the protests. Finally, a decision on formation of the government of national unity was made. And in February 2014, even though when the national government, the unity government, the government for national unity collapsed, the Russian military started appearing in the Ukrainian territories around Crimea and in the east. We called them in Europe the green people because they didn't wear military uniforms, they didn't have the ranks, they were just strange military units that Russia was saying they're not ours, we don't know who they are. And they moved into the territory of Crimea as well as eastern Ukraine. Crimea was not forced really to separate from Ukraine because a sham referendum was organized in the Crimean territory with the Russian ethnic majority in Crimea, because they had the majority of the people were of Russian ethnicity, but also the Tatars in big numbers lived there. They boycotted the referendum. So the Ukrainian Russians voted for independence of Crimea and for joining the Russian Federation, which happened, and the Russian authorities decided to agree to the unification of Crimea with the Russian Federation. And then the same month, March 2014, two independent republics were announced, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic, that were declared independent. Obviously, only two countries recognized their independence, and you can very well guess that besides Russia, it was also Belarus, because Belarus at that time was, and still is, very much aligned with the Russian Federation. And there's one more event which I put in this slide, and I put it on purpose here to start you thinking in a specific manner about this conflict. In July 2014, a Malaysian MH17 flight going from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur was shut down over eastern Ukraine using a Russian anti-aircraft missile book that was towed from the Russian territory to eastern Ukraine and was launched from the territory of eastern Ukraine outside of the control of Ukrainian authorities. Obviously, all passengers and the crew were killed who were traveling on that flight. Why am I bringing that? Because it shows, obviously, that was, well, an accident. It was an accident because that happened by mistake. But at the same time, had there been no war, had there been no Russian occupation, and had there been the control over territory, or had the airspace over Ukraine been closed, which didn't happen, we wouldn't have had that accident. But I'm mentioning this accident here because it clearly shows that a warlike situation in which there is killings, in which there are casualties, it's not necessarily only the soldiers who fight, it's the civilian population, and those are also the bystanders, or people who happen to be in the wrong place in the wrong time. If it hadn't been for the war, we wouldn't have all those deaths that related to the accident. So it is good to remember, it is good, I really encourage you to change the perspective as I did. I try, whenever I talk about the war in Ukraine, I try to be very precise about the fact that it started in 2014, because it's important for the Ukrainians to talk about it in this manner. Which unfortunately shows that the implications of the war were already there. Obviously, they were different than they are now, because there was no full-fledged invasion. And what is more, the Russian Federation never admitted to actually sending the troops to eastern Ukraine and to Crimea. So they were supposed to be the green military, whoever they belonged to. They were not the Russian Federations. But everything changes on the 24th of February with the participation of Belarus, that Russia is amassing the military outside of the Ukrainian border, also in the territory of Belarus. And the 24th of February, I'm sure you all remember, is the day of the full-scale invasion. We all wake up in the morning, depending on the time zone, it's either morning or night, and we're all in shock. Because at least we in Poland, or I'm not saying that that was completely unexpected, but it was very difficult to imagine that a situation of that kind could develop a few hundred kilometers from our border, Europe didn't see a war. Well, there was the Yugoslav war, which was very brutal, very bloody, with many casualties, cases of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, etc., that dragged for years until the war in Kosovo that ended in 1999. We had not seen this kind of a situation in which one country is committing an act of aggression against another. Obviously, as you very well know, the Russian Federation authorities never admitted to an act of aggression. They called it a special military operation. They used different justification for the attack. I will talk about it in a moment. Those justifications were basically based on the fact that there is something very wrong about Ukraine that shouldn't really even come to exist in 1991. But what was worse was that, as you can see here in this slide on the, I think I pressed on something and I stopped the presentation from running. Sorry for that. What did I do? Oh, thank you very much. Okay, I'll be more attentive to the buttons.
No.
No. Sorry for that. Yeah, technology, and I'm lost. Okay, so here you have those, you have the east, you have the Crimea, which is marked in red as occupied by the Russian Federation, and you have those 4 republics here. The 4 republics, the 2 of them you already know, there was Lugansk and Donetsk, but there are 2 more. So there is Zaporozhye and Kherson that were declared independent, and sham referenda on independence were organized in September 2022. In the 30th of September, so that's the last day of September 2022, the Russian president announces that the Russian Federation is annexing Donetsk, Kherson, and Lugansk, as well as Zaporizhzhia Oblast, which are those regions of Ukraine, to the Russian Federation. And they are formally now annexed to the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation is not saying anything about occupation, but from the point of view, you as IR students, and obviously you, dear academics, are more than aware, don't have to explain it, that an act of aggression or an act of the use of military force ends with occupation, which in itself is illegal according to the UN Charter. But then there is a specific law that the occupiers should follow, even though it is an illegal situation itself, because we have the international humanitarian law of armed conflict that defines the rights of the civilian population, but also the conduct that should be applied in the given situation. What are the implications of the war? First of all, obviously, the most important thing for the Ukrainians are the deaths of the people. Their estimates are very vague. We don't have the exact numbers, but from the overall numbers that are available, between 2014 until 2022, over 14 people died because of the Russian invasion that was, from the perspective of the Russian Federation, not Russian. But then after the 24th of February 2022, that means the full-scale military invasion, civilian casualties, at least 21,000, over 21,000 people were casualties, approximately 8,000 people killed. However, some of the other estimates given are point to much larger numbers. Injured, almost 14,000 people. Military casualties, it is said that at least 100,000, more than 100,000 Ukrainians killed and injured, and probably approximately 175 to 200,000 Russian forces killed and wounded in the war. That's the obvious implication of the war for Ukraine. The other obvious implication that doesn't seem maybe that obvious to those of us who are not into the problem of forced displacement, but the other obvious implication is displacement that I've already mentioned when talking about the number of population in Ukraine. Refugees from Ukraine recorded across Europe, but those are only those that were officially recorded, is over 8 million people. And I will tell you in a moment a little bit more about what the legal situation is in Poland and in other European Union states. But also there are over 8 million 8 million internally displaced persons in Ukraine, who still remain within the jurisdiction of the Ukrainian government and who potentially can become victims of the missile strikes, bombing, shelling, and any other activity, but also they can become victims of other hardship that are related to the war: hunger, malnutrition, lack of heating during the winter. February was very, very cold, and the Ukrainian government was doing pretty well with bringing back the electricity and the heating in the houses in bigger cities. But there were days in Kiev when electricity and heating was available only for a few hours a day, which in wintertime obviously is a problem for the civilian population. A few words about what happened to those who crossed the border. Again, those numbers that you have here are only the numbers that were of people who were either registered on the borders crossing from Ukraine to the neighboring countries. Well, they could also take a flight connection, obviously, but they would have to go to a safe place from which flights would be able to carry them further, because the airspace over Ukraine has been closed now since the beginning of, well, actually after the MH17 crash, the decision to close the eastern Ukraine and all the territory that could be reached by the anti-aircraft missiles, the airspace of Ukraine was closed. So basically they could travel by foot, by trains. Very difficult because the trains were not operational, especially after bombing of the railways and railway stations. Car could be an option, but how do you travel a car around the areas that are being shelled and bombed, and there are planes flying all over your head? So many of those people, if they were closer to the border, they would walk to the border, carrying anything that they could. You know, this is the characteristic of forced displacement. If you are being forcibly displaced, you just pack whatever you need. Some of them were carrying their pets, like dogs, on their shoulders so that they could get to the border. And Poland, and as well as other neighboring states, if you remember from this map from the beginning of the presentation, practically opened the borders to the Ukrainians, to the Ukrainian population. The Polish government was absolutely unprepared to receive thousands of people per day, but the Polish society was very well organized very, very quickly, and the civil society organizations set up kind of transition camps at the borders, medical assistance, food assistance. Also, there were people, hundreds of people, young people and old people volunteering in railway stations and bus stations to somehow help those masses that were fleeing through the border. And basically at that time, no one was even checking the documents, okay? So there were some places at the border, some crossings at the border where the documents were being verified, but then when you had like, you know, queue of women and children mostly, because at a certain moment of time, I don't remember when it really happened, after 24th of February, but very quickly the Ukrainian government decided not to let men from the age of 18 to 60 to leave the country. So there were women with children, women with babies basically arriving in Poland and other neighboring states. And as you can see, many of them remained in Poland, many of them remained in the territory of the European Union, but many of them also moved further. However, those numbers are incomparable. For the moment in Poland, we know that we have 1 million, over 1.5 million Ukrainians under temporary protection permit, because the European Union, again, this is something very particular. We can go back to it in the Q&A session if you have questions about it. As I'm sure at least some of you know, the European Union has something that is called the Common European Asylum System. And in the Common European Asylum System, protection can be granted in the form of a refugee status, the three basic forms of protection: refugee status, subsidiary status, or temporal protection. And the decision was made by the European Commission to introduce the scheme of temporal protection for Ukrainians so that the protection could be granted to them in groups, because any application for refugee status or if it becomes a subsidiary status protection needs to be decided individually, case by case. And temporary protection just goes to nationalities that have to big groups that have to flee the area of conflict, as in Ukraine. In Poland, definitely, currently, there are more than 1.5 million. Before 2022, we definitely had legally registered approximately 600,000 Ukrainians working in the country. That was only those who got their work permits. The estimate said that there were approximately 1 million traveling back and forth to Poland and to Ukraine, and obviously they were taking very low-paid jobs, cleaning, working in restaurants, somehow babysitting, etc. And what is also important is that the border remains practically open to Ukrainians. They have to register. Sometimes they are asked by the border police to show their identification cards that were issued to them. Poland has approved a specific law that granted Ukrainians all the rights except for the voting rights. They have everything. They have all the social benefits, and still, now the law has been amended, but until very recently, they didn't even have to pay for the accommodation in the reception center, so they would get it for free. Now those Ukrainians who are legally employed, they have to cover part of the spending on the accommodation. So the displacement definitely, and the situation of the internally displaced, but also the challenges that are related to those who came to Poland. I can again go back to it and give you some more details. What happened to the children, for instance? They had to be taken to schools, preschools, kindergartens. People had to, work somewhere. Ukrainian and Polish are not identical languages. They are much different. So even though we might somehow communicate, it's not the same language at all. So they had to learn Polish in order to be able to study, in order to be able to work. If there was a Ukrainian doctor, they couldn't work not speaking Polish, right? They could work only with the Ukrainian population. So it has been very complicated. I'm saying has been because it still remains a very complicated situation. Destruction of civilian infrastructure, cultural property, a horrible stuff going on there. And obviously for the future, the stalled development in economic and social terms. A very important implication for Ukraine itself is that the Ukrainians have changed their orientation to a large extent to the orientation towards the West. Now, the Ukrainians, it's not only about membership in the European Union. The majority of Ukrainians want Ukraine to join NATO because they feel that if they do not define themselves through the means of a military alliance that the members of NATO form, then they would not get the protection from the Russian Federation. What we need to remember is that the Russian Federation, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, had a guaranteed status by the Budapest Memorandum, so-called. And that was completely neglected by the Russian Federation. So the Ukrainians do not believe anymore that whatever pledges the Russian Federation government makes, that it will bring any good for Ukraine in the future. And obviously, it's very unclear what will happen to the territorial status of the occupied territories in the Crimea. And often, a question that is often asked is it worth to fight for them? Is it worth to wait for more people to bleed, for more soldiers to be killed? That is something that's a very difficult question, but I can tell you answer that the Ukrainians will give you. We have already lost so many soldiers, so many civilians, so much destruction, etc. We're not going to give up. There is no way now for us to give up. There was an idea after 2014, before the full-fledged invasion, that maybe the Ukrainians will negotiate some status for those eastern republics and for Crimea. For the moment, I don't know whether it won't change for the future, but for the moment, it's definitely not possible. And I think that would be, slide. Probably I'm already. I should already be coming to an end, right? No? Okay, I still have some time because I lost track of. Okay, all right. Great, thank you. All right, so I also want to tell you a few things about the international reaction to the Russian invasion, and this is definitely something that you are very much aware of because it goes to the universal level of the United Nations and regional organizations. A few things that I want to draw your attention to. First of all, the United Nations has been perceived as an ineffective organization when you look at the Security Council. Obviously, the Security Council is not the plenary organ of the United Nations. It's an organ which has 15 members, 10 of them elected, 5 of them of permanent status. But we think of it as the principal organ because this is the organ that can somehow react to, as the title of Chapter 7 of the Charter says, threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression. All right? We also need to remember that the Charter is very clear in the principles of the United Nations, Article 2.3, the obligation to resolve peacefully the disputes between states, and point number 4, the prohibition of the use of force or a threat to use force against territorial integrity, political independence, or in any other manner that is inconsistent with the Charter. The guardian of peace and security is the Security Council. Security Council can impose enforcement measures, not with that do not include force, Article 41, or that include, if the 41 doesn't work, they can move, Security Council members can move to 42 and authorize an enforcement measure with the involvement of military intervention. But obviously everyone knows why this is not happening. Russia is blocking any decision, any resolution whatsoever using its veto power. But it's worth noting that the absolute majority of the United Nations General Assembly, which is a plenary body members, have voted to condemn the Russian aggression against Ukraine. However, it must be a little bit surprising when you look at the voting records in the United Nations. It should be visible, I think the print is big enough. That's just an example of one of the votings, two of the votings from 2nd of March and 12th of October 2022. As you can see, there are always 5 countries against, and there were 2 countries that swapped places between March and October. So here we have, what am I doing? Escape? No. Yeah, I'm probably, oh yes, I know what I'm doing here. Yeah, thank you. So, as you can see here, we have Eritrea. In March, the first resolution of the General Assembly with 100, as far as I remember, 147 countries voting in favor, 35 abstained, and 5 voted against. We have a very good company here. Obviously, I'm being very, very cynical. Belarus, North Korea, Russia, and Syria, plus Eritrea. And then Eritrea exchanges the place with Nicaragua. The 4 remain the same. So those countries that are voting against are countries with a specific record of human rights and a very difficult domestic situation. But when you look at the abstaining countries, what is important is that there are countries that, I mean, some of these countries at least voted for the condemnation, like India, for instance, and Pakistan. Probably the other South Asian states would follow. Since India and Pakistan voted against, then we have some countries here, like Sri Lanka, for instance, voting against, abstaining, Bangladesh abstaining. In Africa, South Africa being against it. There are obviously different reasons for those countries voting, abstaining from the support of the resolution. And the situation changes a little bit in October 2022, but still 35 and 5, this number doesn't change. However, over 140 states vote to condemn the Russian Federation. And this makes it more possible for other UN bodies to somehow react to what is happening with through the conduct of the Russian Federation. The Human Rights Council excludes Russia from its membership. I don't know if you remember this meeting of the Human Rights Council where Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, is speaking obviously through some kind of online connection, and then the majority of representatives of states members of the Human Rights Council, they just leave the room, okay? It's kind of I would say, a social sanction of international character that can show the reaction of the international community. What is also important is that, and this is relates to one of the justifications that the Russian Federation used to invade Ukraine. The Russians were claiming that, do we have that? No, I think we don't have that slide here. Okay, never mind. I'll tell you about this. The Russian Federation authorities were claiming that Ukraine doesn't have the right to exist because there is no Ukrainian nation. There is no Ukrainian language. Ukraine as a state is a Nazi state, so the Russian Federation needs to remove the Nazi authorities because the Nazi authorities are committing a crime of genocide against the ethnic Russian population living in the territory of Ukraine. Therefore, we are organizing a special military operation to make sure that we remove the neo-Nazi government from Kiev. We install a democratic or a pro-human rights government, and we get back to normal. So we bring peace, stability, and human rights protection to the Ukrainian territory. I'm mentioning specifically this justification because the Ukrainians were very, very quick in reacting to the genocide claims made by the Russian authorities, because right after the invasion, they brought a dispute against Russia to the International Court of Justice, the United Nations International Court of Justice, for the ICJ to decide whether the Russian Federation has correctly applied the definition of genocide, as there were the accusations of genocide against the ethnic Russians. And what the International Court of Justice did, it decided about temporary measures in the case. The case, an ongoing one, but the temporary measures decided by the ICJ was that the Russian Federation should immediately stop all military hostilities. Obviously, the Russian Federation completely neglected that. But there is another issue, another event that I want to, or important fact that I want to draw your attention to. I'm sure you all know about the International Criminal Court and how the big powers are resentful of this court, but not only the big powers, the African countries, at least some of them are very much against the ICC, claiming that the ICC is biased, that it's only mostly taking the African cases, which, by the way, statistically it's true, but it would require further explanation why this is happening. You can see in the slide, just a moment ago, right? So 2 weeks ago, the chief prosecutor of the ICC, Prosecutor Khan, informed the public that arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova have been issued, which comes as a little bit of a surprise when it is announced. Because as I'm sure you very well know, the ICC does have jurisdiction, might have jurisdiction over the Russian Federation citizens if the crimes were committed on the territory of a state that recognizes ICC jurisdiction, and Ukraine decided to cooperate with the ICC on that particular matter of the war in Ukraine. But obviously the problem is that the ICC is not a domestic jurisdictional institution, doesn't have its police, it doesn't have its capacity to arrest those against whom the arrest warrants are issued. So Vladimir Putin or Maria Lvova-Belova would have to either be submitted to The Hague, to the ICC, or they would need to come by themselves, surrender themselves to The Hague. They have been accused of committing war crimes. The Maria Lvova-Belova, you also have the explanation here, is the member of the office of the president of the Russian Federation. She's responsible for children's rights, and she was indicted because of the crisis with the kidnapped children from the eastern territory of Ukraine. Approximately 1.5 thousand children have been abducted from eastern Ukraine and brought to an unknown place in the Russian Federation, which obviously the forcible displacement of civilian population by the occupier is a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the additional protocols of 1977. So abducting the children also counts as a grave breach, which in other words is a war crime. It's an important move. I see it as an important move not only because of the ICC itself, but because of the change in the approach of the United States of America towards proceedings before the ICC. I don't know if you noticed that the Munich conference, the Munich Security Conference that took place in, I think it was still February this year, hosted Vice President Kamala Harris, the American Vice President Kamala Harris, who openly said that the American lawyers have analyzed the documents and the data and the evidence from Bucha, from Irpin and other places in Ukraine, and they have no doubt that there is evidence for crimes against humanity and war crimes. The Americans are there have been very few instances of the Americans so openly speaking about crimes committed, international crimes committed during armed conflicts, human rights, massive human rights violations, internal disturbances, etc., for the reason that they don't support the ICC. I would say that for years, they have been very hostile towards the institution. So I think this change in the American approach, but also the European Union obviously wholeheartedly supported the ICC. What is more, in the European Union, we have an initiative that is very interesting. Personally, I think that it's one of the most interesting things that institutionally is happening in the European Union now. There is a special task force within the Eurojust agency of the European Union that is collecting evidence that can can help international investigations towards that are going to be related to the crimes committed. The Ukrainian president, President Zelensky, recently said we will not agree to a hybrid tribunal. A hybrid tribunal would be a tribunal in the Ukrainian jurisdiction, part of the Ukrainian domestic jurisdiction, but with international support. He said, no, we want an international tribunal to look into the case and to prosecute the individuals responsible, but that remains to be seen. The Council of Europe excluded Russia, the Russian Federation, so now in Europe we have only two states that are not members of the Council of Europe, that's the Russian Federation and Belarus. But still, the world has not reacted universally to condemn Russia's actions. And it's not only about the war of aggression, that is a crime and that should bring the Russian Federation to international responsibility in the sense of state responsibility. But this is also about the grave, massive human rights violations that have been committed. A very blatant disregard for international order, for the very, very basic rules. If we can't, if the world cannot agree on everything, at least we have to agree on the basics. And it seemed for years that the basics were maybe enshrined in the Charter. Many critics of as you know, there could be someone who would say, okay, but what about the United States invading Iraq in 2003? What about NATO countries organizing a military campaign against Serbia to protect the Kosovo Albanians? And my answer to this is, well, those were illegal acts, but to compare the gravity of those with the war in Ukraine, with the Russian aggression in Ukraine, to me is an absolute exaggeration, because this is the first situation since the Second World War when in a completely open manner a country is invading with its military another country. It's good that we have international organizations in which the representatives of the Russian Federation have to explain themselves, but probably it's not enough to make sure that we can do something to mitigate the negative consequences of the war, and they do not limit to Ukraine, Europe, the European Union, Poland, Romania, Hungary, displacement, human rights violations, but they definitely also relate to a much broader perspective. And I'm giving the pointer to Jakub and the floor to Jakub, who's going to talk about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Dorota. Now, Professor Jakub, which is the head of Department of Area and Global Studies of the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Warsaw, will present his point of view on this important issue. Professor Dorota gave us some very interesting aspects of the conflict, the background, the effects, the characteristics, and now we want to listen to you, Professor Jakub.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank you, Professor Director, for inviting us here. So it is our first time here at the university, at this institute, also first time in Brazil, and we are very happy that our faculty, step by step, will develop cooperation, academic cooperation with your institute, and we hope that it is not our first and the last meeting with students, with scholars, but it is just the beginning of our close cooperation, and we'll be very happy to host you in Warsaw next year, because we hope we are going to sign agreement on exchange of students and memorandum of understanding, I think, in 2-3 months, and it will be opportunity to meet with you in Warsaw. Why it is so important? Because I think the dialogue and discussion, debate, it is very important in academia, and we are very happy that we have opportunity to present our perspective on war in Ukraine. And in this context, when Professor asked us to present academic, of course, perspective on war in Ukraine, but also if we could underline also the Central European perspective, what is very important, and I would like to underline at the beginning, is the terminology. Terminology, because in debate, in discussion, very often we have such terms like Russia-Ukrainian war or war in Ukraine. We underline, especially in Poland, we underline Russian aggression against Ukraine, that it is not a war between Ukraine and Russia, but it is a Russia invasion on Ukraine, Russia aggression against Ukraine. It is the first thing which, especially in Poland, in Central European debate discourse, we are very sensitive. When we talk about implications, because I would like to underline main points and later to give space for discussion, for debate, for your comments, I would like to put stress on 3 dimensions of implications for Ukraine, for Central Europe, or for global order. And at the beginning, I would like to say that probably in a few years, maybe in 1 or 2 years, we should build, as I told my colleagues, my friends outside Poland, we probably will build monuments for Putin. Why? You could be surprised. For Putin united, make Europe again united. It has a big impact. The Russia aggression against Ukraine, in my opinion, has changed a lot, has changed everything. And Russia aggression against Ukraine, one of the real implications was that it was some kind of facilitator in strengthening relations on 3 levels between Poland and Ukraine, among European Union members, and among European Union members and the United States. So it has a huge impact, and we could say in a few weeks, this war solved a lot of problems which were between Poland and Ukraine, between the European Union and the United States. So I think the most important implication is that this war, as I said, has been facilitator in strengthening relations and cooperation between Central European countries and Ukraine, especially Poland and Ukraine, facilitator in strengthening cooperation among European Union members, and strengthening relations between the European Union and the United States. Go in details to these 3 levels of analysis. So first of all, when we talk about Poland and Ukraine, I'm not going to go in details, but we have very complex historical relations between Poland and the Ukraine. And even a few years ago, it was still a lot of historical dispute between Poland and the Ukraine. And suddenly, of course, now we don't focus on this historical disputes, and Poland has become the most important, one of the most important allies for Ukraine, and Ukraine has become very important for Poland. Also, if we look at the history and if we look at the Central Europe and political relations after Cold War, we had also some historical disputes and challenges between Poland and Lithuania. Poland and it was no consensus among Central European states, countries. War in Ukraine has caused that all these problems gone away. And now, as you see, Central Europe could speak one voice. When we talk, even when we come back, when we go back to history, and when it was a discussion about European Union membership, it was some kind of competition between Central European states. If you take into account some events 2, 3, 4 years ago, also in the context of, I will also talk about this, energy security, cooperation with China, cooperation with Moscow. It was differences among Central European states. So it was very difficult to say that we have one block. Nowadays, situation has changed. Of course, quite unique actor is Hungary, but I focus when I talk about the Baltic states, Poland, Czech, Slovakia. We could say that now Central European started to speak one voice. So it is the first very important implication. The second implication, which I would like to underline, it is a huge shift in perception of Central Europe by, and also Russia, Moscow, by Western Europe and the United States. And what Professor Heidrich, what Dorota said, it is very important. War didn't start 24 February 2022. We had annexation of Crimea 2014. And if you look at the reaction, what was the reaction of United States? What was the reaction of Western Europe? Something happened. I remember I was with one professor from our faculty in the United States in Naval College, 1 month after annexation of Crimea by Putin. And nobody in the United States, in Naval College, talked about Moscow as a threat. What was the issue number 1? China. China is a real problem. It was a real problem for United States. And despite that 1 month before Russia started such a policy, aggression against Ukraine in Crimea, it was not an issue. Because United States, as you know, they were completely focused on Asia Pacific. And they didn't treat this Crimea problem as a most important in the security discourse. But also, if we take into account Western Europe, despite Crimea 2014, Germany still develop the project, energy project Nord Stream 2. It was nothing happened, nothing changed. It was in energy, if we take into account energy security, still Western Europe fully devoted to cooperation with Moscow. And when Poland and some Central European states started to underline that we should change the policy, it was no reaction. It was, it is some kind of exaggeration. Why we should stop this? And we already, Dorota and me, we already talked about 2014. But when it was the first example of Russian aggressive imperialistic policy, Georgia, 2008, and nobody, what was the reaction of the West? What was the reaction of Barack Obama? So the war in Ukraine, but the events, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, 24 February 22, has changed everything. Of course, we could we could discuss about how about what was the pace of reaction, German reaction, some French reaction, but this event make more united of Europe. Western Europe has started to change approach, has started to change policy towards Moscow. The first example is energy security. It is decision, okay, let's start to change energy security. We should not be so dependent on Moscow. Also, if we take into account the fact that, for example, most European countries, for example, in France, it was always very big sentiments to Moscow, to Russia. But when Russia aggression against Ukraine started in February 22, French universities have suspended all cooperation with Russian universities. So it is big change, and nobody could predict this 1, 2, 3 years ago. So it is the second element which we should take into account, the change of perception, also in the context of a real how dangerous is Russia. But what Dorota said, it is a question why West did not do before. I gave the example 2008, 2014, but also if you listen Putin in July 2021, he said directly, it is nothing like nationhood, Ukrainian nation. It is no Ukrainian language. It is part of a Russian language. It belongs, everything belongs to Russia, and it was no reaction. And it is the second assumption. And what has also changed? I think also when we talk about implications in the context of European Union, I think that Russia invasion against Ukraine has caused a big change and in perception or in the context of idea of independent European army. As you know, in 10 years ago, a few years ago, it was a discussion, Germany, France, some countries discussed about the idea of independent European army, and it was discussion how to deal with NATO. I think that after 24 February 22, it is no discussion. It strengthened the role of United States in Europe. And when we talk about security, number one for next decades will be NATO. And of course, European Union will develop, for example, military industry, but a real leader in the security field, it will be NATO. And in my opinion, the role in the context of security field and in the context of political field, the role of United States and allies of United States will be more and more important, and the role of Germany has weakened. Why? We have some discussion with Dorota about this, but I think the reaction of Germany, not so quick reaction of German policy makers, caused that it will not be a big trust that Germany could be a real political leader in future. When we talk about Germany will be important player, mostly economically, but in political field, I think Germany lost opportunity to be a real political power in Europe. I gave evidence, statistics, bilateral aid to Ukraine as a percentage of donor gross domestic product. And Estonia spent 1%, Latvia almost 1%, Lithuania 0.65%, Poland 0.6%, US 0.4%. And I always ask on which position is German. German is on 14th position. German spend only 0.17% of gross domestic product for aid to Ukraine. So German is not so active, not only economically, but also politically, as a potential leader in Europe. And in my opinion, the position of German will weaken. And the next issue, it is relations between European Union and the United States. I think that this war and the Russia behavior, Russia aggression against Ukraine has caused that we are in the process of narrowing a gap in perception of security threats between United States and the European Union. As I said a few years ago, for United States, the most important area was Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific, China, Taiwan. We had, and it was the beginning of this new policy of United States was pivot to Asia 2011 by Barack Obama, and later Donald Trump has continued this. And also it was a big discussion and divergence of interest between Europe, Western Europe especially, and the United States, how to deal with China, make business or not. And European Union was not so interested in confrontation between United States and China. And please, if you look at the documents from 2018, 2017, even in 2018, China was treated as a competitor. It was not treated as a main challenge, main rival for European Union. And Germany was very interested to make business with China. But also when you ask about Central Europe and about Poland, even 1-2 years ago, among members of this government was some kind of discussion how to deal with China. United States made a big pressure on Poland. You should follow us. You should be with United States in this Indo-Pacific strategy. Poland was not so eager, and that's why Poland was not so much in favor to support this idea of European Union strategy towards Indo-Pacific. Why? Because we were interested in having good contacts, business contact with China. Situation has changed after 24 February, when European Union and also Poland, but United States understood one thing. It is today we could not divide, okay, this is only limited to Europe, these events are limited only to Asia Pacific. Everything is interdependent. Everything is interdependent, and what Dorota said, when we talk about respect of law, when we talk about minimal standards, international law standards, it is no difference if something happened in Europe or if something happened in Asia Pacific. If we say, okay, nothing happened, and we will not do nothing with Russian aggression against Ukraine. Next could be Poland, but after a few days it could be Taiwan. After a few days, another countries. So it is a more holistic approach in perception of security threats by Poland, by European Union, and by United States. In this context, I would like to underline one thing, especially from the perspective of Central Europe and Poland, because 30 years ago we were in the period of transformation, and we in 89, 90, everything has changed in Poland. And I think we, not only in Poland, but in European Union, we take it for granted everything. Rule-based order, what is it? It is only words, terms. It will be for always. Respect for law, respect for sovereignty, the United Nations Charter, the most important documents, the most important idea, we take it for granted. I think West Europe and the United States did not expect that something like war in Ukraine could happen in 21st century. It was very naive policy and approach towards Russia, that if we make with them business, if we started to integrate it with, we will have a business connection, we'll have a pipeline project, nothing happened. It was very, very bad assumption, and I think we should take into account when we discuss about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jakub. Thank you, Professor Dorota. It was a very interesting combined approach with a lot of aspects connected to the war and the impact of the war or the aggression of Russia against Ukraine, and I agree with you. And we may discuss right now in the different research and courses here at IRI, these aspects have been discussed. So I'm sure that we will have some questions that will stimulate you to develop more your point of view. This is open. We can have some questions and some answers, but let's continue. Who wants to begin? Please. You may use the mic because as we are transmitting by YouTube, it's necessary for the people that are listening us to listen you, okay? So, identify yourself, your name, your course here, and make your appointment, please.
Hello, my name is Lucas. I come from Northern Brazil. I'm a first-year undergraduate student here in international relations. Thank you so much for being here today. It adds a lot, I'm sure, for all of us. And I have a question for Dorota. If it's possible for you to elaborate a bit more on a point that I think you touched on very briefly, closer to the end of your talk, on why would the invasion of Ukraine by Russia be a crime of a greater magnitude than other invasions led by the West, in the Middle East, for example? Because I ask that because my first assumption would be that it has been greatly regarded as a crime for its proximity with NATO and for its proximity with the European Union, like as you showed the border with Poland and other countries, more than this difference. And also because I haven't really understood, like I think you touched very briefly, so I would like to understand better that point of view. Thank you.
Is it clear? Okay. Next one. And then the two, let's listen 3 or 4 questions and we will pass for our invite, our professors, and we shall continue. Please identify yourself, dear Shara, and
So thank you
Yes.
for your explanation, your conference today.
name and course.
Okay. My name is João Pedro. I'm a third-year undergrad, and I think that we see the war in Ukraine in a very kind of Westphalian and Clausewitzian sense, because we tend to stress mainly the state actors, but I would like to hear from you on the non-state actors, especially the violent ones, and I have 2 in mind. Firstly, I think that would be the private military contractors, especially the Wagner Group, and I would like to know what is your opinion on their influence compared to the traditionally employed military personnel from Russia, but also the organized crime, the transnational organized crime, that we know that in Russia has a lot of relations between the oligarchy that rules Russia and the transnational crime, especially the Russian mafia. And I would like to know if you see some trend in this organized crime in trying to subvert the Ukraine since 2014 and maybe before. So that's the question.
Thank you, João Pedro. At the end, yeah.
Hi, my name is Mateus, and I'm studying here in the Institute of International Relations. Good afternoon, Professor Jakub and Professor Dorota. It's a pleasure to be here to attend the lecture of teachers who study the war in Ukraine. So my question is about concerns about the internationalization of the war. As we know, NATO's countries have been assisting Ukraine in supplying weapons and war equipments and also committed to help in various ways. The European Union is providing for the first time in its history weapons for a country that is facing a war. So, dozens of countries have committed to help in providing military aid, and I quote here: Belgium, Portugal, Italy, Spain, Greece, Czech Republic, Poland, Romania, Canada, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Norway, Croatia, and Slovakia, as well as Israel and Australia that are not from the European Union or NATO. What is the risk that in a conflict with so many countries indirectly involved, there will be directly entry of the country or blocs such as NATO, or even military aggression by the Russian Federation against another country than Ukraine, turning this war into a conflict of even greater proportions?
Do you have a question?
Yes.
Yes, you make a question, and after we will listen, but we have after that another round, okay?
Sure, great. So I would like to build on the questions by João Pedro.
Name and...
Okay, my name is Rafael. I'm a third-year undergrad. And I would like to build on the questions by João Pedro and Mateus. Actually, based on João Pedro, I would like to talk about cybercrime, because we heard a lot after mainly 2015, I guess, Cambridge Analytica and the elections, about the power of Russian hackers and like the information environment. So what is the role of that, both internally and at Ukrainian as a form of making it an unstable environment and helping that narrative of the Russian aggression? And regarding Mateus' question, it's not clear to me, still today, what's behind putting miscalculation about all of this. Professor Jakub mentioned the strengthening of the relation between the West and Western Europe and United States, and we have like all those casualties from the Russian army. So from all the perspectives, everything backfired for Russians. So what is behind such a miscalculation and misperception of actually thinking that they can pull things off? Like they didn't even believe that the West would react the way it did, or what happened? So that's it.
Okay, colleagues, Jakub and Dorota, you have the questions from Lucas, João Pedro, Mateus, and Rafael. Who will begin?
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for the excellent questions. Again, surprise, my first surprise came after the meeting that we have with students in Pukirio, and also very nice group, very interesting questions. And here, again, the questions are really deep and definitely require complex answers, but I'll try to be as brief as possible and as concise as possible to also let others ask questions. Lucas, I think I maybe touched too briefly on the problem. And that's why it has the in a sense a misunderstanding. So in my opinion, if I were to elaborate, the Russian aggression from the point of view of international law is precisely the same illegal act as was the American aggression or intervention, if you want to call it this way, 2003 in Iraq, or I also mentioned as another example, the NATO campaign against Serbia for Kosovo in 2003, I think I said 1999, 2003 Americans and the rest of the coalition going into Iraq, and then 1999 Kosovo. I do not count into it the attacks American and the rest of the coalition against Afghanistan post 9/11, because this was regarded to be a self-defense, which was confirmed by the Security Council when the Security Council convened after the North Atlantic Council was convened. Both in the American context in Iraq 2003 and in the NATO context in 1999, there are definitely cases of crimes being committed during the military operations, so could be regarded or were regarded as war crimes. But it would be very difficult to point to crimes against humanity, not to mention genocide. Here we have a situation in which one country is invading another, so definitely we have the responsibility of the Russian Federation for the crime of aggression, understood as the General Assembly in 1974, 3314 resolution on the definition of aggression defined it. There is no doubt about that. So here, legally, there is a parallel, and, you know, the Americans in 2003 tried to obtain the approval of the Security Council. They didn't manage because there was no weapons of mass destruction. There was no proof on that. The French blocked it. Germans who were not permanent members, obviously, but they were non-permanent membership, part of non-permanent membership then. So it was, the language was different, the justification was different, but that was illegal. NATO, well, you can question whether it was legitimate, whether it was good or bad, but it was definitely illegal. And any other use of military force outside of self-defense or Security Council authorization is illegal. What I was trying more to point to is that there has been none of these situations led to such an such a blatant breach of human rights protection, international humanitarian law, cases of war crimes being committed on a daily basis, the shootings of civilians, the sexual crimes committed against the civilians, the rapes, the massive graves that were being discovered around Bucha and Irpin and other places around. This was not the case in any of those interventions. The crime of aggression itself that I see from the legal point of view, if I look at it from the point of view of international law, no difference. However, one may look, if you look at the verbatim records from international forums, I would say that the language was a little bit different. However, one might say that it's a point of argumentation and it's a point of your kind of political view, right? The Americans were claiming that they have the right to go to Iraq because there are weapons of mass destruction and they want to protect the civilians. The Russians are claiming we are going to Ukraine because there's a neo-Nazi regime that is committing genocide against the ethnic Russians. So I'm leaving that aside because this is a point of, I would say, view in a sense. But everything else that was happening after the full-scale invasion is different. So crimes, but also the annexations of the territory. In none of the cases, the Americans in 2003 were occupying power, that's it, and they never questioned it. They were also the occupying power with the rest of the coalition in Afghanistan. The Russians, there were, except for the 5 countries that are blocking the resolutions, that are voting no to the resolutions in the General Assembly, no country has openly said that the referendums were legal. They all call them sham referendums. You know, so that changes things. But especially, my argument is especially the crimes against the civilian population that are being committed. War crimes are also being committed by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian authorities get very angry when international commissions point to that. But the fact is that the Russian prisoners of war sometimes are not treated according to the Third Geneva Convention. But crimes against humanity at this scale, this has not happened, okay? That's why I differentiate it. But that, obviously, thanks for the question, because definitely requires explanation. Jakub, do you want to take any of the questions? Shall I continue with? Okay, all right. So, Jean Pedro, the non-state actors. The Wagner Group, that's a very good question, a very difficult topic, because the Wagner Group is, first, it's a private military company, that's for sure. But the second thing, and this is the more problematic thing, is that it has clear links with the Russian authorities. So the Russian Federation uses the Wagner groups as kind of, you know, proxy military that is being authorized to act on behalf of the Russian Federation as a state, but there is no official confirmation that the Russian Federation is using the Wagner Group as a military proxy. So it's not a typical private military company issue, because if you look at, and again, I'm very critical about those issues and about the things that the Americans were doing in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and there were also private military companies that did have some relation with at least some of the members of the American administration. But here the situation is that the Russian authorities have been basically rejecting the claim that they have anything to do with the Wagner Group. And it is clear that it's not true, okay? And the data that has leaked and the intercepted the conversations between the military commanders, and what is more, it seems that the Russian Federation is using the Wagner Group in the military operations in Ukraine to do the most dirty job, which makes it even more difficult. And now, obviously, from my perspective, the most difficult thing about it is that the Wagner groups will never be brought to responsibility, because they do not possess international personality. They can be held responsible, and it has to be linked to the Russian government. Until it's not linked to the Russian government, then legally, again, if it goes to prosecution, there will be no chance to have anyone persecuted or indicted for the participation of the Wagner group. So they have and definitely there is a significant importance of their activities, not to mention their activities outside of Ukraine, okay, in Africa and etc. Transnational organized criminal groups, well, definitely this also speaks to how the Russian administration is functioning, but also, I'm sorry to say that, because again, probably our Ukrainian colleagues would be angry to put a kind of a parallel between the two things, but organized crime in Ukraine is also a very serious problem. It's also a problem because organized criminal groups are operating within this whole mess that is carried on by the war. They're operating on the Polish-Ukrainian border, they're operating in Poland. They're kidnapping children, there is modern slavery, there's sexual abuse, and not to mention illegal arms operations and drugs trafficking. There is a lot of that. To what extent it plays a role in the, in the warlike situation, except for, besides what I said, I don't think I'm knowledgeable enough to get into it because I don't specialize in it. But I think it is the presence of the organized criminals group, transnational organized criminal groups, is always common in wartime situation. It's even more common in this war because the transnational organized crime had been there before the war, okay? So it got stronger, and there is a clear connection to the Russian, and unfortunately, to some extent, there used to be a clear connection to the Ukrainian authorities as well. And to touch upon the cyber terrorism and hybrid warfare altogether, well, that plays a huge role, and the European Union has been really trying to help Ukraine, but also has been working on the territory of the European Union to somehow combat the cyber warfare that the Russian Federation has been using, which has a very strong influence. And though this influence is, it's not only like recently, I think, when the Slovak government decided to supply the Leopard Leopard tanks to Russia, some of the, I think the Ministry of Defense servers went down again because the Russian hackers attacked them, and then there was a displayed communique on the warning not to cooperate with Ukraine to help to weaponize to bring more weapons to Ukraine. So that's a very important issue, and again, I'm not that knowledgeable in that topic, but I know that the European Union has had its own programs and its own funding to help combat the Russian misinformation, disinformation, and cyber warfare on the territory of the European Union, because it largely speaks to the ressentiments or to the negative sentiments towards the Ukrainian and also bringing weapons to Ukraine, etc. And about the Mateusz, about the internationalization of the war by providing weapons and what's the risk of further internationalization and further havoc. I'll put it this way. Personally, I don't believe that the Russian Federation will treat it as casus federis to attack any of those who are supplying weapons to Ukraine, because I don't think that Russia wants to get involved in a military confrontation with NATO, and it's vice versa. But at the same time, I think that this is basically the best of the bad options that the third countries have chosen to support Ukraine, because the only way for Ukraine to win this war is to bring more weapons. It brings risks. Do you know how the weapons are transported? They are transported to this Polish airport in Rzeszów, a city the name of which is really difficult to pronounce for foreigners. And there's a Jasionka airport that was tiny. Now it's huge with all the military presence of the Americans and other troops, and all the weapons is being transported by air car, mostly by air cargo, to Jasionka, and then they put it on cars if they come by plane, or trains, and they transport it further to Ukraine. So basically, officially, none of the third states have declared official military involvement in the conflict, but obviously, you know, I would assume that if it was not the strong European Union states or the United States of America, but if it was only Poland individually outside of the NATO schemes and European Union schemes, then the Russians would be more prone to get to reaction. Maybe not against Poland. Kuba said before, Jakub said before that Poland could be the next country. I don't think so, because, you know, there are so many American troops on the territory next to the Ukrainian border. Anything happens to an American soldier, then we have an immediate American reaction. You know, after the remains of the Ukrainian anti-missile rocket hit the Polish territory, we had like 6 hours of complete information havoc, because we thought that we were going at war with Russian Federation, okay, which was really scary. I don't think anybody wants that. That was like a month and a half ago, and the initially in autumn. Yeah, I don't remember. I would have to check the exact date. But initially, obviously, we thought that it was a Russian missile. But then it was the anti-missile, what do you call it? Anti-missile missile, or I don't remember the name. Anyway, and the remains fell on the Polish territory. 2 civilians were killed. A house and a farm were destroyed. But basically, you know, the problem was for the government, how do we put it? It was the Ukrainian missile that hit our territory that killed our people. So it was, you know, a collateral damage brought by the war. And there was a rhetoric that very quickly came to the media through the governmental channels saying that we blame it on Russia. Had it not been Russia, there wouldn't have been a war and there wouldn't have been this accident. So it's similar to the MH17 bombing, right? Or crash. Everyone, nobody wants it. The Russian Federation doesn't want it, and the NATO don't want it. The United States administration doesn't want it to internationalize this conflict. And to my understanding, again, I'm not a security expert, but to my understanding, the Russian Federation authorities are, in a sense, tolerating the fact that more and more arms are brought to Ukraine. And Raphael, you asked a question that is related to it. What is behind the miscalculation? Well, we don't really know what's behind it, because we don't know what is in Putin's head, but there are several justifications that are possibly true. First of all, I don't think that Putin didn't realize that the European Union especially, but the rest of the world as well, would be so eager to help Ukraine. Putin administration was not aware that Ukrainians were so well prepared, because they were well prepared. They have well-trained troops, and they were preparing their troops for that since 2014. So there were even some Polish military instructors working with the Ukrainians. They were really at a good track to get stronger and better. And then the weapons, to think half a year ago that the EU states and Americans would supply the Ukraine with tanks and aircrafts, military jets, that was unimaginable, okay? And then one more thing here, I think from the arguments that I can think of for the moment, I think Putin also thought that the destabilizing factor would be Belarus. I don't know to what extent you are familiar with the President Lukashenko of Belarus trying to use migrants to send them to the Polish territory through the border, to push them to the Polish territory to destabilize the European Union. Those migrants, mostly Iraqis, Afghanis, Eritreans, Ethiopians, Nigerians. There's a humanitarian crisis of a magnitude that you don't really want to think about, because officially 38 people died at the border in the woods, in the forest. Unfortunately, there is information that more deaths might have occurred, and that not necessarily the bodies were identified. I don't even want to think about it as a real thing, because it's going to be, I think it's bad enough to have 38 people dying on the border in the 21st century of a country that is accepting 1.5 million Ukrainian refugees. So that's a kind of a side event in this whole war, but it's important because Belarus and Lukashenko was doing it to destabilize the European Union, and he didn't succeed. Unfortunately, that's at the cost of those migrants. Because the European Union countries and the European Commission, they don't want them on the territories of other European states. So they'd rather keep them at the external border, not let them go to travel to Germany. And many of them, crossing the border, they ask to have a taxi called to take them to Germany, which is, obviously they don't know the geography because they would have to cross through the whole country. But at the same time, at the cost of these people, Poland and the European Union managed to stop that destabilization. And Putin treated the policies of Lukashenko as an additional element. Belarusian territory was used, which means that Belarus has also participated in an act of aggression because it gave its territory to aggressive acts. But at the same time, it seems that President Putin had thought that the Belarusian government would do more to help the Russian Federation. Those are the three reasons that I can think of, but generally I would say that even the best specialists on Russia, they don't really know. They don't know what happened, that they miscalculated so much, because it's a really tremendous difference to what the plan was when we look at the situation on the ground.
What do you want to add?
Okay, very quickly, thank you very much for all these comments and the question, and starting from the last question, because I remember when we had a discussion with Dorota and also Yes. And our friend who is watching now us now from Warsaw, Professor Roberto Habel from Victoria University of Wellington, he's now he's visiting professor at our faculty. And when we discussed 1 year ago, Dorota and Robert didn't believe nothing happened. But I'm not expert on Russia, but I said he would do this. Why? I would give 3 reasons. First of all, it is imperialism, imperialistic approach, but not only Putin, imperialistic approach of Russian society. It is a main problem. 80%, even more, think like Putin. And it is not from in the last 10 years, in the last 20 years. Since 17th, 18th century, they have imperialistic approach. Central Europe, it belongs to us. Soviet Union, it was a map of Soviet Union. This area belongs to us. This is not, Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian language, nothing like this. And it is referring to question about the difference and you ask about Libya, you ask about Iraq. It is very easy answer. In this context, of course, we could have different opinion about the Western approach, Western behavior, legal aspects, everything what Dorota said, breaking of law or not, following United Nations Charter. But we should, most cases, we should analyze in the context of humanitarian intervention. And of course, humanitarian intervention itself, it is issue of debate, discussion. But the second most important thing we should underline, in the case of Libya, Iraq, have you heard that somebody question the sovereignty of the state? Somebody say, okay, we should cut, no Libya, no Iraq on the map. Nobody question this. It is the big difference. And if you, as I said, and we should underline this, if you look at the documents, speeches of Putin, he said, Ukrainian nation is no right for being Ukrainian nation. It's very clear message, and everybody is treated, he told something, he never do this. So imperialism. The second thing, I would say the weakness of state. Russia is not a great power. Russia has only nuclear power and military, which is, you could see, very weak, and energy resources. Energy resources and the nuclear power was two pillars of believing that we are a great power. But in practice, if you take into account economy indicators, Russia is not a great powers, and it was a problem in Russia. A great aspiration, but no base, no elements, no instruments. And the third, it is, of course, psychological. If you study IR, foreign policy analysis, also psychological aspect, but connected with two first factors. Putin started to think, okay, how somebody would describe me in 100 years, in 50 years? I lost almost everything. So we should take into account all these three elements. One comment to these non-state actors, Wagner groups. I would say that it is also a best example of weakness of the state, of Russia state weakness. Why? How corrupted, how government, people from authorities of Russia is secret service, how is the connection between mafia, business, different non-state actors. It is the best evidence of the weakness of this state. So I think miscalculation, and one word about internationalization of war. We were in quite a new situation. We didn't have such a situation since Second World War, and it was the question how to react. And the European Union, NATO, Poland, were aware that, of course, Moscow would like that Poland or NATO would start a war. It would be the best gift for Putin. So it was a question how to deal with this. But I would like to point out that one of the miscalculations of Putin was that since 2015-16, but especially in the last 2-3 years, as Dorota said, Western countries, especially United States, was more and more aware that something could happen. And they started very close cooperation with Ukraine. And one more thing, it's also very important, also from your perspective. Since 2015 and 16, it was internal domestic process in Ukraine to change elites, political, economic elites. Before 2014, most people at the top at universities, in business, they were over 60. They had very often connection in the past with the Soviet Union, with Secret Service. After 2016, 2015, young people, 30, 40, came to power. So it was generation change in Ukrainian, and Putin didn't take into account this. So I think it was also quite important thing.
Thank you very much. Let's listen one or two more questions. Please, where is the mic? And I want to make a final question also.
Hello.
Okay, you the first, here you are the second. Okay.
My name is Lorena. I'm a third-year undergraduate. And my question is about
Desculpa, your name is?
Lorena.
Daiane.
Lorena.
Lorena.
Yes.
Lorena.
Yes. And I would like to ask about
Tá ligado o microfone? Eu praticamente não estou te ouvindo.
Tá. I would like to ask about what Professor Jakub was talking about, that the war made the Central European countries unify and speak in one voice. And so I would like to ask, why did Hungary decided to be away from the war? Prime Minister Orbán has been criticized many times because he claims that Hungary should stay out of the war or do what it's in his interests and be neutral. So I would like to ask, why didn't the country express itself as clear as the other Central European states? If it's a political act, if it has something to gain or lose with it?
Thank you. Here.
My name is Alexander Sherstabitov. I'm a visiting researcher here, and I came from Russia. Thank you very much, professors, for your talk.
A professor from Russia that was incorporated to our institute in a program that USP and other universities of the state of São Paulo developed in order to receive professors and researchers that came from places that are connected with war and conflicts in general. So Alexander is our guest professor.
Thank you for the talk, dziękuję. So I have two questions. The first one about the voting in the UN. Are there any further analysis or studies, or maybe your opinion on why some countries abstain? So what are their incentives? This is important because in Russia, Russian elites and Russian propaganda frame this in a very tricky way. They say something like, look, the countries that represent more than half of the world's population are against Western imperialism. And they abstain just because they're still economically dependent on the West. So they try to Russian elites and propaganda try to justify these strategies of the countries that abstain. And the second question, Xi Jinping recently declared that China would increase military spending as if they're preparing to the war. So what's the outlook? What's your opinion on this? Because I think it may shift the focus, especially of Americans, from Ukrainian case to Chinese back, and especially in terms of upcoming elections, it's very important. And maybe even American elites would push Ukrainian elites, President Zelensky and other European countries to freeze the war, even with the loss of territory by Ukraine, because they would like to shift back to Chinese issue. So what's your outlook on this? Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. The last question, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Eduardo Wilde. I'm visiting from Universidad Católica Boliviana. Thanking you both for the
There are
nice
two
chat.
professors that are from Bolivia. They are the professor, and Professor Guillermo Aponte is our visiting researchers also.
And I would like to know, basically, from your point of view, who is gaining points in the international arena beyond the United Economic Union. For example, it's clear to me that Germany has lost some points on the spotlight, and seems to me also that apparently China has an interesting perspective here besides Taiwan's issues.
Thank you very much. Jakub, you can begin now. After Dorota will add, and I will have after you a final question.
Thank you very much. So, thanks for comments and question. Very interesting. So let's start from Hungary. Of course, we are aware that we have in the European Union problem with Hungary. But if you look very carefully on Orban policy and how Orban behaved publicly in rhetoric, and later what he did in practice, so he used this rhetoric to play game, to gain more from European Union. But if you look what European Union did till now in the context of Ukraine, how much money European Union spent for aid to Ukraine, we could say that, okay, publicly, rhetorically, Orban could criticize the European Union, but he's not able to stop nothing. He's not able to change, for example, of policy of Poland, the Czech Republic, or Baltic states. So I think also that in calculation, and it is coming back to your question, maybe Putin expect that Orban would make a little more problem in Central Europe or in European Union. So he's not treated as a real partner, and he used this rhetoric, in my opinion, for domestic audience. But later, when he came to Brussels, he talk, but later he never stopped nothing. He's not able to veto action of European Union. So I would have a look, analyze his behavior more in the context of domestic arena situation. About who is the biggest loser, I put also here in my presentation, I think opinion 3 countries, Russia, and I think Russia it takes a lot of time, 50, 100 years, when Russia has become treated as a serious partner, and it will take a lot of time. I remember in 2014, I met with one of professors from St. Petersburg University, and he told something like this: please remember, in 10 years, it was 2014, so he told this in 2014. He told in 10 years, Russia would need to say sorry for Putin. So, and would have a lot of problem after Putin. He said this in 2014 in Frankfurt during the conference of World International Studies Conference. That, and of course, but what would be after Putin? It is a main question. If Russia is ready to have new elites, it is a main problem, and I'm not optimistic. So Russia is the biggest loser. The second loser is China, as you said. China was in perfect situation a few years ago. Even if you look at the European Union policy towards China, China could maneuver in Central Europe. You know, in the case of Hungary, in the case of Poland, they promise a lot of investment. They try also to play differences between European Union members. German, Belgium, Netherlands, France. Nowadays, Europe is more united. Look how it is the reaction of European Union for China Confucius Institute. Have you heard that, for example, in Belgium, in Netherlands, they decided to close the Institute Confucius? So it is more, China is China, which was the biggest beneficiary of globalization, is angry because Europe, United States are more united. If we take into account Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific, European Union was not so interested. United States said we need respect rules-based order in Indo-Pacific, South China Sea, and so on. But for most European countries, it was, oh, it is somewhere far. Why we should lose business with China? Why we should follow United States? Now, Europe, Japan, and the European Union, Japan, Australia, United States are more united. They said, okay, we need to treat the rule-based order, the basic rules of international relations, we should be against aggression, so we should be more united. It is nothing which we could treat for granted. So China, in my opinion, and if you look at the China behavior, rhetorically, they support. But in practice, have you got evidence that China deliver any military assistance to Russia? No. Economically, not. Yeah, but But if you look, even, you know, I was very critical to India behavior. But India also started to change step by step own perception of the war in Ukraine. Why? Of course, India wanted to use opportunity to buy cheap economic things, but they started to change this because the war, when war is longer, and if we take into account Indo-Pacific, and as you know, in Indo-Pacific we have a close cooperation between United States, Australia, Japan, and India. So war is longer, who is a loser? India. Because United States, okay, say, okay, India behave like this, so we put stress more on Australia, Japan, our traditional partners. So I think, and one more thing, because your question was very important. Your question, why Global South at the beginning started to be more abstain in voting. In my opinion, it was misperception, and also it was a little mistake of the West. What kind of mistake? Because West and Biden treated to show this war, to Russian and Russian aggression against Ukraine, how United States perceived. They tried to explain this: democracy versus autocracy. But it's nothing refer to democracy versus autocracy. It is about if you respect basic rules of international law or not. And if when United States and the European Union started to underline it is war crimes, it is breaking of basic rules of international law, it is I would be very open with you. It is no difference, in my opinion. I said this several times publicly. It is no difference between Putin behavior and Hitler behavior, between Holocaust and what happened in Ukraine. It is very strong, but I am aware what I said. It is on the basis of evidence. So when we started to talk like this, that if you accept such behavior, so next day it will be not Poland, because in Poland it will be, you know, as Dorota said, a lot of US military West is engaged. But next day it is, as I put here, we could come back to power politics. So who has more military? We could do everything. So next day, United States occupied Mexico. Next day, China made everything what they want together with Pakistan, with Kashmir. So we could come back to such politics. Do we want? It is a question. Do we want to come back to great power politics? So I think the big mistake was a few years ago to say democracy versus autocracy. It is no discussion about democracy versus autocracy. It is a question. Do we respect minimal basic rules of international law or not? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do you want to add something?
Maybe a few words, not to take too much time. About the question on why Hungary has been opposing some of the actions of the European Union, I would add, obviously there are domestic issues and there are funds from the European Union that are blocked according to the mechanism Justice for subsidies that come from the European Union. Hungary has a dispute with the European Union on the reform of the justice system like Poland does. So the funding has been blocked, and Orban, whenever Orban's government is threatening that they will block, Hungary will block the decisions that need unanimity in the European Council or in the Council, they claim that once the European Union unblocks the funds, we are going to support the decision. With aid to Ukraine, it's a little bit different because it is the Commission decision, because it's the Commission funding that they use for the assistance, especially humanitarian development assistance. So it's a bit different because it doesn't require Orban's vote. But I would also add to it energy issues. Obviously, Hungary has an interest not to impose too many sanctions on energy because of economic relations with Russia, but also the Hungarian government does not want to close relations with China, so it wants to be closer to China and still allow the Chinese to invest in Hungary, which obviously could have an impact if it was that openly blocking Russia. But I think it's also the personal, political views of Prime Minister Orban. Personally, I think there is a bit to it. The question that was on the voting in the United Nations. The Russian propaganda is partially true. That must be said. But definitely there is much more pressure on those countries that are abstaining than just being against the anti-colonial rule. China and the Russian Federation building coalitions in the General Assembly. China economically. When China was winning over the hearts and minds of the African leaders, it was when those countries were breaking diplomatic relations with Taiwan in order to open those relations with China. And that was precisely for money and investment. China doesn't want anything in return, and there is no question of the rule of law, and no question on so there's no dependency clauses in the agreements. So it's, except for some few cases, if you look at the list, if you look at African countries, specifically African countries, this is the ability to build a coalition based on economic arguments with those countries in the General Assembly. South Asia, a bit of a different story, because we have India leading and Pakistan leading some of those South Asian states. So my take on this is that there is really an ongoing battle. And you can, when you read the verbatim records, and when you read the assumptions, how those states will vote before the session, and then you see how they vote in the session, some of them change their mind just during the session, because there is pressure from basically China and Russia. China is pressing economically, and it helps. And one more thing that I wanted to say, about who's gaining the points besides the economically united European Union. I think the US is a huge winner in this whole situation, because it becomes, as Jakub said again, the guardian of liberal international order. But I think it's also my take is that it is strengthening the United States economically. War is always, I mean, it's very difficult to talk that someone is gaining over war. War is a very bad thing, but obviously economies run on wars, right? So you have a situation in which the production for war, we see that in the United States already, the shifts in production, that factories need to change the production to weapons by orders of the president in order to get ammunition for the arms that is being supplied to Ukraine. But also, for instance, you know, Poland is going to construct an atomic energy plant, the first in history, and Americans are going to do it for us. So, you know, there will be many issues also related to energy, and I have no doubt that the Americans are very pragmatic about what they are doing. So one is the global liberal order, that's one. But I don't think that the United States of America has ever, maybe Wilson, who finally paid the price of the Americans being out of the League of Nations and the whole post-Versailles treaty or Versailles agreements. Maybe Wilson was a blind liberal thinking about the good nature of the world and good nature of the people. But I don't think that the Americans are not going to take into consideration the economic gains, not to mention the fact that they show off in front of China, and that can give them an economic boost in relations with China. So that's my take on it.
So
Thank
if
you.
I may add one more thing, and I think this work will have a big implications on European Union and especially European Union approach to Global South. Because as your question about abstaining, we understood, and you and European Union understood, if we want to be a global player, we need dialogue, we need discussion, we need to treat such global players, emerging powers like India, Brazil. We should take into account your perception. We should, and I had a meeting with one of the diplomats from Japan, and he said, okay, we are trying to strengthen Quad in Asia, India, Australia, Japan, United States. We are aware that India behaves differently when we are behave in the context of war in Ukraine, but we need India in the context of China, in the context of liberal international order, which is based on international institutions, which is based on rule-based order. So we need to have some concrete proposal, some constructive proposal. And I think it is just beginning of the discussion in Europe, in European Union, how to deal with emerging powers, to have in future also the support from them. So it is also very significant implications of war.
Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of this extraordinary session, and I want to have the final remarks of our guests, but I want to have your final remarks with the answer of a question that was not talked here. Is that the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons by Russia on this war? More than your analysis, I want to have your impression. Do you think that this is possible, or is just a bluff of Putin? How Polish society has been prepared to deal with the perspective of the use of nuclear weapons in this war? Because Poland is so close to the scenario of war that if there is the use of nuclear weapons, of course, this will affect the Polish society. There are the construction of bunkers, building bunkers, the use of drugs. How in practical terms, the government of Poland is dealing with this terrible perspective? With this final question, I want to listen to your answer and your final remarks.
Thank you. I will put it this way. I want to believe Lloyd Austin, who has just recently said that there is no indication whatsoever of the Russian authorities planning to use the nuclear weapons. We do have fear in Poland of tactical nuclear weapons. Personally, I am not a fan of governmental policies in preparedness to anything, and I think we are completely unprepared. The one argument for this being that we don't have a single bunker in Warsaw that could accommodate the civilians if there is a nuclear attack. My take on this, on the situation, is that the Russian authorities may decide at some point to use tactical nuclear weapons. I don't think there would be a use of weapons that could actually lead to the contamination and destruction of the territory of Poland, but obviously, first of all, I'm not an expert in military issues and security issues, so it's more of my perspective of what I've been following as a citizen of Poland, a country that's so close to the Russian Federation. And I did check the availability of the bunkers, and the nearest option for me is to go to the metro station, the nearest one, and to hide in the metro station. So I checked that, okay? So that's my personal remark. To give you the final comments, I try to detach my personal and emotional attitude towards the whole situation, and when I talk about it as an academic, obviously I try to see it from the point of view of things that are in international relations, but at the same time, obviously, we have our own fears and our own doubts. I think there's much less fear now than there was at the beginning of the war. For the moment, it seems that Putin has been bluffing, but what worries me personally as the citizen of Poland, a country that is so close to Ukraine, is that we are unsure of what is going on in the Kremlin, and we are unsure of what the decisions of Putin and the others around him are. We are unsure who is ready to take after Putin, and whether it will be more stable or less stable, whether it would be a Hulk or more someone who will have a more peaceful approach to end the conflict. So yeah, the answers to your question are, especially the second question. I think that the Polish society, the government, I don't think there has been any preparation introduced. Obviously, we have reserves of medicine that could be used, but the medicine will not be very helpful if people don't have a place to hide. And the fact that the Polish government was completely unprepared to accept the refugees that started fleeing to Poland after the 24th of February, and was basically done with the hands of the civil society and all of us. People were giving their private, rooms in their apartments to those people who were migrating from Ukraine. And as I told you, hundreds of volunteers helping the migrants. And then obviously the government started action, but it was late. Had it not been for the Polish society, probably wouldn't have had that much assistance. So that's my answer.
Your final remarks.
And my final remark is that I would like all of us to think, and this is also something that I'm telling to myself, that whenever there is a situation of a war in which the very basic norms of international character are being breached, it should be of interest to all of us, because we don't want to go back to power politics. I don't think that the realist version and the realist view of the world in which power plays the most important role is something that we would like to see, and I hope we won't see it. So I do encourage you to get to think about the Russian aggression against Ukraine in this way, that it's not a conflict taking place thousands of kilometers from the place where you are, but it's something that it simply means a complete change of how international relations was since 1989 at least. And I think the significance of it is different, but as big as the 9/11, concerning what happened after and what has been happening after the 24th of February. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Jakub, your final remarks.
Okay. Thank you very much. At the beginning also I would like to thank Professor, Institute and all of you for taking part in this seminar and discussion, because as Dorota said, I think it is very, very important topic, and what is the most important? We should be aware that this war, this Russian aggression against Ukraine, implications, it's not only limited to Central Europe and Europe. It is, I think, we need to understand this. Of course, it is like academic debate, a discourse, and I use, not by accident, very strong comparison, because it is, even if we come back to the history, in the 40s, when one of the Polish citizens informed the US government in the 40s about what happened with Jewish community, what Hitler did, nobody at the beginning believed in the United States. So that's why we should be taking into account all evidence, not rhetoric, but evidence, numbers. And Dorota put on presentation concrete number slides, and we had different stories from Bucha, from villages completely destroyed. Women, children killed in 21st century. We should take it very seriously, and we should ask for the question what we should do it. Of course, I'm not naive, and the global politics and states will always did, do, and will have own interest, own business. It is not, a big love between the states. But we should, what Dorota said, we should respect minimum standards, basic rules of international law. Without this, we are in big danger, because we could come back to the power politics, and I think it is dangerous for especially smaller states, smaller, weaker states. So I think we should discuss on the basis of evidence, on the basis of arguments, and even sometimes the comparison could be very strong. We should not afraid to use very strong comparison. And your question, I think it is a bluff. I don't believe, and it is a weakness of Russia, because Putin was completely surprised, and he didn't take into account that West could be more united. It is, if we go, in details about business connection, German connection, Nord Stream 2, Russia, the French approach towards Moscow, to culture, he was completely surprised. French universities suspend, I think, first time in the history, cooperation with Russian universities. Also, our faculty suspend all cooperation with Russian universities. So I think he was surprised, and I think he will not use nuclear weapon, because it would be completely the end of the Russia. It would be the end of the end, and we need to take into account one thing. He's not only one man who will decide. It is whole procedures. So I think even if he would like, he will not be allowed to use a nuclear weapon. So I'm sure, and even I would say even more. When we will meet in 1 year here, I think the war, it will be already no war. Ukraine will win, and Russia will give back all territory. So I think it takes 1 year. So in 1 year, when we'll meet, yes, you could check me if I'm right. Okay, thank you very much once again.
Well, in the name of our community here at the IRI, I want to thank very much Professor Jakub, Professor Dorota. We had an extraordinary afternoon discussing points very interesting and different and more close approach to this issue of the war. And I expected here, independently of what happened in the future, but I want to receive you here both a year from now. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, the people that follow by YouTube. Professor Jakub and Professor Dorota will stay some more moments here to talk with you, to take some selfies, and to congratulate with you.
And we are waiting one more thing. Well, thank you once again, the director, professor, whole institute, and thanks a lot for your participation. And we are waiting for you in Warsaw. We hope that we'll have a lot of opportunity to discuss also about this topic, but also different when you are, as an exchange students, visit our faculty.